Right, good evening everybody. We were waiting for a number of participants to join, and a number of them have been delayed and will probably watch our presentation at a later stage, because we'll actually be providing it as a recorded presentation available on the P&C Federation website in the coming week. So a warm welcome to everybody. And in the spirit of reconciliation, the P&C Federation acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. My name is Tim Spencer. I'm the President of the P&C Federation. And with Year 12 students finishing formal classes this week, and with the upheavals of COVID-19 during this year, P&C Federation felt it was an opportune time to allow parents to hear directly from NESA about this year's HSC and the provisions that are in place to try and make the HSC work under fairly difficult circumstances. This is part of a series of webinars that we've been running from P&C Federation on key issues in education. So if you're interested in keeping up to date, please keep an eye out on our website and our social media feeds for upcoming events. We've invited the registrants tonight to submit their questions during the registration process. So we've asked our guest speaker to respond to those questions tonight as best they can. As part of the Q&A that I'll be facilitating as part of the event. If you have any questions during the webinar, please post them in the Q&A section you'll find on Zoom. There's a little button down on the bottom right. You can type your question in there. If we're unable to get to it during the event, we'll pass it on to NESA and see if we can get the question addressed post-event for you. The event is recorded, as I mentioned before, and will be available on our website, the P&C Federation website, probably sometime around early next week. We're breaking this webinar up into two sections, basically. So the first part will be looking at the HSC specifically, followed by a short Q&A, and then we'll be looking at the curriculum, again, followed by a short Q&A. So that brings me to introducing our guest speaker. So if we could please welcome Paul Martin. Paul is the Chief Executive Officer of NESA. Prior to his appointment last year as CEO of NESA, Paul was the Executive Director Quality Teaching at NESA. And before that, the Manager of Professional Learning and Initial Teacher Education at the former New South Wales Institute of Teachers. And Paul has played a key role in the implementation of the New South Wales Government's Great Teaching Inspired Learning initiative with both NESA and the Institute of Teachers, and has been a policy advisor for New South Wales and Australian governments. And most importantly, Paul was previously an English history teacher. So he does come from a teaching background, and is also a parent of two children in the public system. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Paul.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm really pleased to be here. Tim mentioned that, yes, I'm a parent in the public system. In fact, I understand why perhaps there's people registered and not been able to get here, because it's the witching hour. I've got a 12-year-old downstairs who's trying to keep the dog quiet while my wife takes my daughter to netball training because the grand final is on Saturday. I think we're only allowed to take one person to the grand final. I'm not sure, but and my wife recently indicated to me that she's been pleased to be elected as an officer at our local school's P&C. So I have as much contact with the P&C in my home as I do at work. A real pleasure to talk to parents. I enjoy it immensely. It's been the most difficult year at NESA, and we are simply a sort of lightning rod and touchstone for the sort of difficulties that students have faced and parents looking after students have faced in 2020. Our entire energies at NESA have probably been more focused on the Year 12s and the HSC. It's always the blue ribbon event of the NESA calendar, and in fact, the education calendar in New South Wales. But this year, we haven't run one HSC, we've run about 10. The staff have worked tirelessly to try and provide support for students and their parents. And you know, it's been difficult. And I at some point, I mean, I know we can't do it, but I'd love to have a ticker tape parade down the centre of George Street for all of the 2020 HSC students, their parents, and the teachers that got them through, because it's been a magnificent support for them. Okay, we had the first board meeting at the beginning of the year. It was in March, a little later than normal. 2 items on the agenda. The first item was the New South Wales Curriculum Review. We had to look at that and provide advice to the government of the day, Minister Mitchell and the Premier Berejiklian, because this process started under Minister Stokes, I believe. So that was one item on the agenda. The second was the emerging catastrophe of COVID. If you remember what early March was like, we had that first meeting of the new board remotely. So Professor Peter Shergold, who's the chair, has still not met face-to-face most of the board members because we've been holding these remote meetings. But that item of business was around COVID, was to put together a COVID emergency committee so that we could respond nimbly and flexibly to anything that would arise depending on the nature of the COVID pandemic. If people remember what it was like in March, I was at work one day and the next day the city was empty. It was almost a ghost town. It was a strange feeling. We did not know whether the students would be away from schools for a month, 2 months. The rough estimations then were even a term or 2 terms. Our concern was, can we run a fair HSC, a set of exams, if the teaching experience of New South Wales students is so varied that we can't comfortably or confidently say they've been given a fair and equitable opportunity to learn? Can you run an exam system in those circumstances? So right at the beginning, we were nervous about whether we could do that. The COVID Emergency Committee was Professor Peter Shergold and myself, the 3 sector heads, Mark Scott, Jeff Newcomb and Dallas McInerney, the head of our curriculum committee, Dennis Fitzgerald, and the head of our assessment committee, Jenny Allen. So we had a variety of perspectives there and expertise. The first thing that committee and the board did was to say, we can't run our normal assessment, school-based assessment, with the same level of rigidity or rules that we would normally do. So we relaxed the number and weighting and type of assessment tasks to allow schools to adapt those assessment tasks around what was really happening in their environments. Now, if you think about it, Western New South Wales, border towns, large inner city high schools, one teacher schools, there was so much variety. We couldn't possibly do anything in terms of mandating a single way. What we said was, okay, you run your own assessment tasks. The second thing we did then was start thinking about how we dealt with the health issues. Most importantly, we were told back then, and each of the decisions we made was in the light of the health advice of the time, some of which has changed, but by and large, our decisions have been, I think, reasonable in the circumstances. So the second thing was social distancing. We had to kill off the dance, drama and music ensemble work. Anything that required students to work together at that point was not something that we could countenance. It was very disappointing. A lot of those students, it's the thing they love most, they've been looking forward to, they've done a lot of planning, but we had to follow the health advice. And so we kept the major works and the projects and the performances alive, but we had to adapt them around the social distancing advice. The students all went home somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks, just on either side of those end of term 1 holidays. We then were in trouble with how that would affect students differentially, particularly in relation to major works. If students were doing a painting or a series of small paintings at home, it possibly would have not affected them as much as somebody who needed the facilities of the school to work with, you know, the big art work on the wall, or the you know, woodwork and metalwork and, you know, the technical kind of expertise, plus the access to teachers. So we knew that we wanted to make sure that they could continue, the students could continue those works, but we needed to apply a little flexibility there. So we said, righto, the teachers know best and the schools know best. We're going to, for the first time ever, let those teachers mark their own students' work. We knew there might be a question mark around integrity, but I have to say, one of the things that we had to do this year was trust. We had to trust the schools, we had to trust the teachers, we had to trust the students and the parents and everybody. We're all in this together. We believe that the teachers would do the right thing. We also embarked on a significant professional development exercise because a lot of those teachers had never marked an HSC major work before. So one of the benefits potentially is that there'll be a lot of teachers out there in 2021 who understand the marking criteria in a way they never have before, and that will help them in their teaching of those major works and those specialist areas. We had a conversation about the exams. We were running a two-track set of COVID meetings. The first was immediate issues, and we mentioned a couple of them. The second was what happens if we can't run exams. I was in conversation with all my colleagues interstate. The Victorians went out early, and actually they probably, given the second stage of shutdowns that occurred, may have done the right thing there for themselves, but they postponed exams for a significant length of time, which meant that the marking process, the ATARs and the university offers would be pushed out into 2021. Our advice from our stakeholders, and we consulted widely, and from the Minister and the Premier, was that the best thing we could do for our 2020 Year 12 students was to offer certainty, and that there were a lot of students really concerned about ATARs and university offers. So we found a week, 3 days of school days and 2 days of a weekend, that we could add to the front of the exams and without delaying the exams too much. And that would allow all of the ATAR and university offers and the calculation of results to occur as per normal. That week was not to compensate for the 6 to 8 weeks they lost. It was to allow them to come back after the holidays, get a bit of contact with their teachers, what I call TLC, a bit of a pep talk. You can do this. You know, you've got the study time. We've mostly got the class teaching time. So we gave them an extra week there. We also provided a lot of advice around illness and misadventure. Our illness misadventure processes from NESA. So illness misadventure occurs if something happens on the day of the exam or immediately prior. People often don't understand that there is a school-based illness misadventure. So something happens around the time of an assessment task or something in the school. The school can apply its own processes there to compensate students. But for the HSC exams themselves, if something happens immediately prior or on the exam day, our processes apply. So we thought that our illness misadventure, its current incarnation, would cope with what was happening with COVID. So if there were particular schools that were shut down for a week or 2 weeks or a day or missed a trial exam, the school-based illness misadventure processes could apply for those schools. And if anything happens on the day of the exam, I think we had a couple of schools closed last week for 2 or 3 days for deep cleaning. But if that happened on an exam day, we have now got, we've given advice to schools for alternative venues. But if worse came to worse and they couldn't sit the exam, then the application for illness misadventure for that cohort would apply. So what we've tried to do is stick with our processes, long tried and tested. We've dealt with floods, we've dealt with bushfires, we've dealt with significant calamities on an individual and personal level for students. This time, we felt that the same things could apply, but we would have to make sure that they could adapt to scale. We've dealt with students on the border, a significant number of students. I think there was 118 living in Victoria but going to school in New South Wales. We had some hard border closures there. We managed to try and deal with that, I think, appropriately. Some on the Queensland border as well. We've more recently been working out what we do with the exams if the whole of the state closed down for 2 weeks or the whole of the exam period. Look, frankly, now I don't think that's likely. I think I'm not sure how many cases there were today, but it looks to me like we'll get through the exams. I can't promise, or who knows what's going to happen. But We might lose some individual schools on individual days, but we provided a lot of advice about additional supervisors, additional exam rooms, alternative venues. So we think there's readiness in the school community. They know how to do this. They're looking after their kids. They're very well prepared. So we think that our processes have covered all of the things up to this point, and we're ready for the exams. The big issue was certainty. We didn't want any student in New South Wales in year 11 and 12 to kind of put their head up and say, well, it's not going to happen. I don't have to try. You know, I can stop worrying, or I'm giving up. We wanted to keep them focused on the path of HSC exams. A couple of other things very briefly that the COVID committee did. We had to adapt around year 11 as well, because we had to give the same sort of dispensation for year 11 students, which meant that number, timing, weighting of of assessment tasks. We gave allowance for that for year 11. We are also with the school inspection process. The NESA inspects schools, and we look at the programs that they have prepared for their teaching and learning. For 2020, we said, look, given that there is so much uncertainty around the K to 10 area in the time of COVID, and you can't get through your normal programs, we trust schools will concentrate on the literacy and numeracy that they need to in primary, but that they have this sort of special capacity to adapt around the syllabuses as per their student need. I think that was really useful. On a personal level, when my kids were coming home with some of the work from school, schools went from no real experience of remote learning to everybody home within the space of a week. It wasn't perfect. No one would say it was perfect, but they did a pretty good job in the circumstances. You know, there were rough spots and there were things that didn't work. And I'm not going to say that every experience for every student was equal, but given the scale of the crisis and the capacity of the system, it did okay. But I was going to say, when my own kids were coming home, I think there was, in some respects, need to calibrate how much work they could do at home. You know, if parents aren't teachers, they supervised it, but you know, you struck a year 9 maths problem and you're in deep trouble. I mean, I certainly was, or you know, some specialist areas of art that I know nothing about. So I think that NESA saying you can calm down schools, just do what you can do in the circumstance, do your best. We won't be checking up on your teaching and learning programs in the same way we normally would. That gave schools a little bit of license to relax around the expectations of that COVID period. We also took away the requirements for vet courses where they had work placements, because no one was taking them on. So we had to say, right, no NESA work placements this year. You may know, of course, that there are about 5,000 to 6,000 teacher trainees, professional experience, or PRAC as it used to be called, that couldn't get into schools for a fairly long time there. We relaxed all of our requirements around the unis. More recently, we've been talking about the year 11s. We will be providing advice very, very soon around the year 11 students. It will be the case that some of the COVID requirements will have to be extended, and others not so much. We learned a lot this year. We learned about the capacity of the schools to adapt around the lack of face-to-face. I think that we potentially will have to maintain the relaxation on the number and weighting of assessment tasks, and provide advice to schools that say that most of those conditions are the same for this year's, for the next year 12 cohort, because effectively they start in 4 weeks time. So we'll carry on a lot of those, and I believe we've been providing advice to schools about that today. We've done our best. I don't know that it's been perfect, but I would argue that we haven't had to backtrack on a decision. The students have mostly been comfortable and confident within the environs of the NESA expectations. There are a slight loss of, and I mean slight, we normally have a sort of a dropout rate from around the 1.7, 1.8 mark any given HSC year. It's slightly up, but not to a large degree. We were really worried that a lot of students would drop out after that 6 to 8 weeks and not come back, but that's not been the case. I can only applaud the teachers, and I think the parents have done an amazing job. You know, imagine the stress that's happening in all your homes. I have family members to sit in the HSC this year, and it's been really tough because it's not just the HSC, it's the close friendships and bonds you make with your year 11, year 12 colleagues, the particular relationship with teachers as you delve into the subjects matter that you love, the raising of the funds for the formal, the picnics, that rite of passage has been sort of disrupted. But NESA has done its best. We're still working hard, and happy to talk to anybody who's got particular interests and concerns. I might just mention one more thing, Tim, before I go. I think I've answered a fair few of the questions in that, but a couple of things. One is this is the first year of the minimum standard, the HSC minimum standard. This year's cohort had the opportunity to pre-qualify with their Year 9 NAPLAN if they received a Band 8, and about 40% of students did. The rest of them have had to pass the NESA minimum standard test, and we've increased the numbers. It used to be X number of weeks and X number of sittings. Basically, we've said go as many times as you can if you need to, because COVID has affected the teaching and learning. There will be some students who still haven't met the minimum standard. It was a government decision to introduce that. At the board meeting yesterday, at the NESA board meeting, Mark Scott indicated the huge effort that have been put into schools into students, so that we're into a pretty high proportion of students having met the standard. We've still got a little bit of time before the exams. There's up to 5 years after the exams. And the general belief is that those students would be significantly more disadvantaged trying to go out into the world without basic literacy and numeracy. I agree that finding out that you don't have basic literacy and numeracy skills by year 10 or 11 is a bit late. And it really needs to be addressed in K to 6. But I think the minimum standard has refocused the whole of the 3 sectors onto making sure students meet that. I might just leave it there. I think I've answered a lot of those questions just in that overall introduction. Tim.
Yes, thanks, Paul. I think there's a couple of things I've just picked up on from the questions that I might throw at you. In terms of a student not or having misadventure this year, are there year 11 results used at all if there's a problem with their trial and their HSC?
So the calculation we would, in order for year 11 results to be used, they would have to have no results in their school-based assessment across the course of the year and sit no exams in that subject. So I don't think that's the case. What we will do is maximise or make sure we use as much of the results of the Year 12 assessment program and the HSC exams as possible. And only when there are no or large gaps would we think about back into the year 11 space. The schools would send us an assessment, an estimate or an assessment of what they've done across the course of year 12. They do that anyway when there's been, every year there are students with cancer. There are students who have significant issues of health where they miss large chunks of schooling, and we get a ranking and a mark for those students, and then we moderate it with the and use the HSC exams. I think in ACT they made a big play about using the year 11 results. I don't think we'll need to. I think we've got it covered here. Yep. I think there was some conversation might have been WA about using NAPLAN or as a moderator, but we're not going to have to do any of that. I think we're there.
Yep. Now you mentioned the 5 years beyond the HSC to cover the minimum standards. Can you just explain that for our audience tonight, just quickly?
So if you don't make, I think there's well over 90% of students that have met the minimum standard. But this is the first year the HSC has moved from a completion credential. You're past the finishing line because you've done 13 years of schooling and you have sat the test and made a decent attempt. It was a completion credential. This year it has a standard attached to it that's from literacy and numeracy. So 90 odd, 95, 96, whatever percentage of students have passed it. And then there are students who have not met any of the elements, and some have met some of the elements, but not all of the elements. So there's 3 pieces of writing, I think, in the numeracy, 3 pieces of reading and numeracy. So some have met some, but not all of it, and some have met none of it. This is a very small number. We want to make sure that those students can still get their HSC, even if they don't meet it this year. So we have organised for the exam to be available up to 5 years after for any HSC student. You don't have to go back to your school. You don't have to go to Services New South Wales. You don't have to come into NESA. We've contracted, it's a remote proctoring service. They do it for university exams when students are at home to do an exam. It prevents cheating, or it's got it's like an invigilated exam, but for students outside of an exam centre. So we've organised for that to occur over the next 5 years, and then we'll send out an HSC form to you. It's an HSC certificate to you.
Okay. I do have one question, is that if a child is actually functionally illiterate, there's possibly no way in that 5 years they would ever.
Well, I would hope that, in the 5 years that, it's a tragedy and almost it's appalling that someone is functionally illiterate after 13 years of schooling, but that's a separate question. And I think some of the work that we've done with the minimum standard will mean that there'll be much more attention paid. I'll also say that the curriculum review, which I'm talking about in a second, is an attempt to address some of those issues much earlier. So hopefully we'll be in a position where that doesn't occur. Yeah. But I would hope that a student within 5 years of leaving school could overcome any deficit that they've come out of school with, but I can't guarantee that.
Yeah. So in terms of a student that's actually directly impacted by COVID, either themselves or their families directly impacted, and they have obviously to self-isolate for a period of time during the exams, what sort of provisions have you got in place there?
So if they produce a doctor's certificate, we'll go down the illness misadventure path. If they've done none of the exam, they'll get, we'll use their assessment from the school. If they've done, say it's dance and they've done the practical parts but not the written, we would be able to, we'll use whatever we've got of them, and there'll be an adjustment made, an assessment made by our psychometricians, our test administrators, about the missing pieces. That's the same. I mean, we may have more of them because of COVID, but in any given year, there are students who are too ill to attend an exam, and we accommodate.
Yep. Okay, I think you've addressed the year 11 moving forward into next year.
Yeah.
In the sense that they'll probably follow similar guidelines.
Unless we get a vaccine, Tim.
Well, yes, here's hoping. But no one's got a crystal ball for that, unfortunately, at the moment. So I think I might, considering the time, if you could move on to the curriculum part of it, and we'll have a Q&A after that.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Tim. Look, I thought because I was appointed as the permanent CEO this year, and I was acting as the CEO last year, but I thought 2020 was going to be the year of the curriculum review. And of course, it just got swamped by the tidal wave of COVID and then the HSC. The curriculum review. So Jeff Masters did 2 long and extensive consultation phases. First of all, for an interim report and then a final report with recommendations. The interim and the final report did not differ largely. I think there's 22 recommendations in the final report. The NESA board considered them on the first meeting they had this year. The general view was that Professor Masters' report identifies the key issues that are a problem for curricula in New South Wales. In a couple of areas, the board was keen to explore some of his recommendations further, and rather than fully endorse at the moment, but say, let's have a further look. I'll come back to those in a second. We provided advice to the government, and then the government announced its support for the general directions of the review. And in the recommendations, it supported all of them, except supported 2 in principle, one in relation to major works for HSC students, a compulsory major work, a compulsory project. And the other one was in something called untimed syllabuses, where it referred those 2 recommendations back to NESA for further work. The third, there was another recommendation that was noted, which was a mandatory study of languages in New South Wales. I'll tell you why that one was noted. Firstly, we have over 100 languages taught in New South Wales. In order to have a mandatory language, you would need to pretty much identify one or two. And secondly, we would need a significant and teaching workforce for those languages. I think there's a real commitment from the government around languages, but it's a long-term process, not something that needed to come immediately out of this review. Jeff's work identifies a couple or two or three major themes. The first one is that our syllabuses, particularly kindergarten to year 6, are overfull. By that, there are a series of major sort of outcomes or expectations for a year level in a subject or a stage in a subject. Then there are dash points and dot points underneath it that elaborate or explicate or describe how that might be met. And then sometimes there's actual examples of particular types of teaching that might go on. So whereas some countries may have a very fine and thin syllabus, and then the rest of the work is done by the programming of teachers or by textbooks or by particular other ways of fleshing out support materials, the thin syllabus. In New South Wales, ours were just chock-a-block with our material and the Australian curriculum. And every time somebody wanted something new, things were added in, but not necessarily taken out. So Jeff uses the phrase decluttering, Professor Masters. I would prefer streamlining or sequencing or clarifying. So his first and universally applauded recommendation was slim them down and get the sequences in the right order. Now, if you miss a year of maths, you're in deep trouble the following year, because maths is such a sequential building block set of learning. In English, in literacy in particular, in the first, say, K to 4, it's very similar. If you don't know how to read or form your letters or sound out your letters or understand your basic punctuation and grammar, you can't do any other subject, and you certainly can't do any more English. So he was saying, get your sequences right and get your key concepts right for particularly K to 2 and then expanding over time. I was a history teacher. In history, there are two types of, if you're going to declutter, there's what constitutes the learning of history. If you want to be a historian or understand what history is, not a historian necessarily, but just understand how history works, what are the conceptual things about history? And then we as a society think, well, our students should learn something that goes to who we are and what makes us Australians, or how the world works. So there's content. So there's sequences of skill sets and sequences of content. Everybody wants students to know something about Australian prehistory before white settlement or colonisation. Everybody, I think, would expect us to know something about Australia's contribution in the wars. People would expect us to understand that we sit within Asia, but we have a European heritage. So there'll be a lot of that material has to go in, and the sequences in the right order. So that was the decluttering and the clarification and slimming down. So teachers have got more time to spend on the things that need to be taught, and also on the students who need to have the additional attention. So then the second theme of Jeff's work is that, and it refers back to what I said earlier with the minimum standard. I'll use my little bloke again. Sorry, that was my daughter calling from London. I'll turn that off. She went to Burwood Girls High, did very well. Great school. The issue there is students progressing. I was going to use my son for an example. His handwriting wasn't that good. He's left-handed, and his fine motor skills actually were a difficulty for him to progress. So instead of it being fixed up in kindy, it became a bigger issue in year 1 and then compounds through time. We end up with a proportion of students for whom they get worse as they go on because the deficit or the missed piece of teaching has never been compensated for. So Jeff's argument was the attention of students needs to be make sure that there are no progression without with a deficit, without any, that students need to be addressed to move through the syllabuses so that they don't move on until they know what they know, and then they've got the prerequisites. He calls that untimed syllabuses. There's an argument about untimed syllabuses that there may be a problem if students get further behind, because even though they're progressing at their own rate, they're falling behind their peers. And there's a strong belief that we should have an expectation at a year or a stage level. So what does my son or my daughter who's X age, how do they go in relation to their previous work? Are they progressing? But how do they go in relation to their peers? Are they falling a long way behind? Are they moving ahead, but not in relation to their peers? So Jeff's view around untimed syllabuses, we've got to get that right, was to try and make sure that students don't fall behind. The third big tranche of his work was in relation to senior secondary. We have an academic curriculum in the senior secondary years because when the HSC and senior secondary was designed, it was mostly designed around university entrance rather than heading out to the world of work. And we now have changes to the school leaving age, which means almost everybody stays to year 12. 40% or 50% of students apply for uni, 35 or 40 or whatever it is, go. That leaves a very large tranche of students for whom the academic curriculum may not be serving them well. So Jeff Master's view was that we need to have more practical application of the traditional academic subjects and more applied learning in VET courses. So he thinks that we need to rethink the way senior secondary works to make it better for students, better for the world of work, better suited to the various pathways they follow. So there we go. There's the decluttering, there's making sure the students don't fall behind, and there's the senior secondary. The Minister agreed with all those general directions and identified a timeline. Professor Masters mentioned in the document about 10 years. I have to say that there was a great deal of impatience from the Premier, and it's reasonable impatience from the Premier and the Minister. Well, 10 years means that the student of next year's kindergarten is almost finished school before you finish these reforms, and you already say these reforms are essential. So can we get a tighter timeline? So we've got to do K-2 maths and English in 2022, and some of the senior secondary work. In 2023, we're doing 3 to 6 maths and English and K-2 in the other content areas. And 2024, everything else. It's punishing, and it's punishing is the wrong word. It's challenging. NESA has 50 years of delivering syllabuses. We delivered 17 new HSC syllabuses last year, including the first ever Science Online course. The subjects, the senior syllabuses went down a treat, very well received. We can get the work done, and we will do it on time, and we will make sure that the teachers get a better syllabus to work with as soon as we can get them out there. It will be a high expectation on our teaching workforce, to particularly a primary teacher who's got to get across all the KLAs in that delivery schedule. But I always say this: firstly, the syllabuses will be slimmer and they'll be clearer, so they'll be easier to teach, not harder. Easier to program, not harder. And the second thing is, maths is maths, English is English, science is science. We're not inventing them from scratch. If you taught them last year, but we identify the key issues this year and show you that you've got more space, our job shouldn't be that teachers have to do an enormous amount of different programming. It should be an easier pathway for them. So we've got an implementation timeline that I've just indicated. We've got a steering committee that is made up of the same people. It's the 3 sectors and the Curriculum and Assessment Committee. We have all of our normal NESA committees that have representations. Tim's on, I can't remember which one you're on, Tim, but we've got P&C members on our committees. We will reach into the parent community with drafts of various pieces as we go on. We'll make sure our syllabuses are clear and easy to understand for and by parents. They are technical. I won't apologise for the fact they're a technical instrument for a teacher, but frankly, they should be understandable by parents. We're going to land some of the culture wars with a bit of luck. You may know about, phonics versus whole language, or times tables versus concrete materials, or whether you teach in the gender and the sex education stuff, it's always a fraught area. And we will have people who don't like what's in the syllabuses to some degree. But frankly, NESA has great expertise at landing these documents, and it's very exciting. So hopefully in a few years' time, maybe 6 to 8 years' time, the number of students coming out of year 6 into year 7 that will have met the minimum standard will be at 95% at year 7, not at year 11, not at year 12, 95% at year 8 and 7, because everything has been done in relation to the new syllabuses. So I'm very excited about it, and I will happily talk on this forum as we progress further over the next little while. If you end up with a conference face-to-face, Tim, happy to have further conversation. I think that's 7:44. I've left myself a bit of time to answer questions. Anything else?
No, I think that's a pretty good summary, Paul. I do have a couple of things I'll throw in there for you to answer, and then we can probably move through some of the more specific questions.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a general set of questions that we've received about how the curriculum and syllabuses are developed and what sort of consultation goes on, and how they're implemented in the end. So that, I know that's challenging, being on the curriculum committee myself. I know it's actually a complex process, but I can give you a minute to try and summarize it.
Okay, so you do I'm not a curriculum design expert myself. If I had Sophia Kezadou, who's Dr. Sophia Kezadou, who's the executive director in the area, and we've got Paul Kale and a range of other. I've just picked up a brilliant literacy and English expert from elsewhere, who'd be leading the team for the English part of the K-2 and K-6. So they've got to get the design right. What does the syllabus look like? Jeff has given us a challenge to make it sort of seamless from K-10, but with the year and stage levels punctuating at various points. So it becomes a much more of a spiraling sequence. So you get the design right. Our design and the Australian curriculum design is broadly the way we will go forward anyway. Then it's a matter of getting the sequences and stripping out the content that we don't want, so that there is clarity that one thing leads to the next, or that something needs to be, for example, something needs to be repeated at a later year. For example, the way students might write, they might learn to write an explanation in year 3, but the complexity of the expectation around that writing will change over time. So you don't just write a syllabus as a vertical set of skills and attributes going forward. It also has to be horizontal across the other KLAs. So the writing expectations that are being taught in literacy are the same ones being expected in history or maths or science. So what you end up doing with constructing a syllabus is, at the same time as you're doing an entire structure, you're filling in, or we're going to have to, the immediacy of the K-2 area at the same time. We will have K-2 going to consultation. We'll have K-2 finished by the middle of next year. We'll probably have put it through curriculum committee and assessment committee and some selected processes of consultation. I'm happy to make sure that Tim and a select group, or you nominate a group of people, can have a look at our drafts. I have to be honest with, we can't go through a long involved 2-year consultation process. This has to be in schools by the end of next year. But we'll make sure that the P&C are in. I think we'll have, middle of next year at the latest for the K-2, and we'll start showing the senior secondary probably earlier than that. And then we'll just build it up over time.
Mm-hmm. So we've had a question that's come up over many years. When is the HSC likely to move to more online? Considering you did science extension last year, it was quite successful. Is there plans in the pipeline to go online for certain subjects?
I think we'll take it as we'll take it slowly. If I was going to hand on heart, I don't think that we'll be sending trucks of papers around the country for the next 50 years. It's kind of ludicrous. Having said that, the online assessment process has still got hiccups. People will remember what happened to NAPLAN Online a couple of years ago. Right? The whole, what was it? The firewall prevented schools from getting access, and it pretty much fell over. If that happened in the HSC, it'd be catastrophic. So we will probably be a late adopter of online assessment, and we'll be cautious and conservative for very good reason. We'll probably do the technology HSC exams online as a logical next step. I'm speculating here, people, so you know it's not something that we've decided, but we'll then move sort of sequentially through the exams. The hardest one, of course, are the long writing pieces, and English has the whole 70,000 students sit it on the same day, which is an enormous, you know, bandwidth and access to computer issue. So Tim, yes, we'll get there. I think it's utterly inevitable. We transitioned from nobody working from home, or very few people working from home at NESA, to 400 people working from home over a weekend. When push comes to shove, we can do these things, but I think we'll probably be a cautious adopter of an online HSC.
Well, that's good to hear. In terms of the curriculum review and Jeff Masters' recommendations,
yeah.
When you've got a situation in rural or remote areas where you've got a rapid rotation or frequent rotation of teachers, skilled teachers out of areas, or you've got teachers teaching well and truly out of their subject area, was that addressed in the curriculum review at all?
No, it wasn't.
How would it be dealt with?
We can't. The thing that NESA doesn't do is ever get into the role. Like, you can't claim illness or misadventure. You can't claim misadventure if your teacher teaches the wrong text, or if you've got a poor teacher, because there is the length of the piece of string from poor to brilliant is not something that we're in a position to make a judgment about. So when you're talking about teachers teaching out a subject area, it's vexed. It might be that the teacher has a major and a minor in a content area. So the minor might be, might be PD, HPE and maths, and they're teaching maths. It doesn't mean they're not trained to teach maths, but it means it's not a major. We rely on the schools and the systems and the sectors to appropriately timetable for the Year 12 students. But it's hard in rural and remote areas. They can't offer some subjects. I think technology is helping. I think one of the things we've really learned this year is we can do a hell of a lot more with technology than we've been very cautious. So it's not, I think, like open learning, online learning to support rural and remote is the next big movement in education in New South Wales. I just think it's coming at us, and it'll be such a boon, for people in the bush. I'm often just sort of anecdotal, but my father-in-law, they live in the Riverina. He can see a Sydney specialist now online. This is just, I think that ultimately we'll be in a better position to produce and provide for quality teaching anywhere in the state.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. The curriculum review, obviously, the work that you're undertaking in the next few years, as part of that process, a lot of the syllabuses that were in development or almost ready to be released were actually put on hold for a period of time until there was some certainty. So are you able to speak quickly about where those syllabuses that were already developed, that were on hold, will go, or is that all going to be rehashed again as part of the bigger process?
Oh, Tim, I think they're going to be our secret early surprise. I think we'll make sure that we'll be able to blow the dust off them and say, look how quickly we've done these things. We'll have to make sure that they comply with Professor Masters' structural arguments about scope and sequence and the look of the syllabus. We might have to go back and see. They have to bring out the applied knowledge a little more, because he's very keen on that. But by and large, there's a few syllabuses that are ready to go that require a smaller amount of work that we'll be able to release earlier, because all of the hard work, as you've indicated, has already been done. There's geography, there's creative and performing arts in primary, I think. There was technology syllabuses.
Yep.
So yeah, a lot of work already done. NESA has done 160 syllabuses in the last 8 years or something or other. I can't remember. It's our bread and butter.
Yeah, exactly right. Do you have available, or are you able to produce a roadmap for general consumption to parents?
Yeah, I can. I didn't. I said to Tim earlier that I've been delivering PowerPoints on this stuff for the last couple of weeks, and they bore me. I mean, I hope I haven't been boring, but I find that the whole PowerPoint thing, to some degree, is a limiting model. But I do have them, and they have the tranches of work, the timelines of implementation, the consultation processes, the working parties, the makeup of the steering committee, everything that I've talked about. I also have one that have all of the considerations for COVID and the HSC. I will make sure Tim gets those tomorrow, and you can issue and distribute them.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Obviously, a big question is how the curriculum changes will affect the HSC and the ATAR moving forward.
Okay. There's mixed views about the ATAR. Professor Shergold, in his national report, is quite critical of the way that the ATAR shapes secondary schooling, not just 11 and 12, but right through. That it, to some degree, determines subject choices and staffing, and is really only applicable to the 50% or whatever that go to uni, and that many universities now use ATAR only as a part of their entrance process. So there's the ATAR carries a lot of criticism. The ATAR is not delivered by NESA. We have nothing to do with it. It's run by the University's Admission Centre, which is an organisation set up by the universities. So if you ever see the universities saying, criticising the ATAR, it's actually their baby, the ATAR. We provide the marks that go towards it. On the other hand, it is clear. It is a finish line that everybody understands is equitable to the extent that it's the same finishing line for everybody. If you move away from an ATAR, you don't necessarily move to nothing, you move to something else. So the question that has to be asked of getting rid of an ATAR is, what are you replacing it with? And it needs to be equitable, and it needs to be transparent, and it needs to not favour particular groups of students over others. If you end up with, for example, in some parts of the world where they've got rid of ATARs, universities have their own exams. That, in America they have the SATs, which then becomes the de facto curriculum for a lot of schools. In others, they have interview processes, but interviews don't always deal with students who are nervous or shy, or who don't have particular sets of skills. There's often a set of cultural and socioeconomic skills that interviews play into the hands of. So ATAR is under immense attack. It should be criticised. All of us should be under critique at all times. But my comment would be, we should be careful about it until we know what replaces it.
Sure. That sort of segues, I suppose, into the current adoption by the New South Wales government of what you're doing. So I suppose for everyone that's listening now, the report was quite wide-ranging in its scope, and it proffered a substantive change in the way that the curriculum would be operated, and the time disconnect in terms of a student not attaining something by a set period of time.
Yeah.
And if they didn't achieve that, you marched on regardless, was one of the key driving forces, I think, behind Jeff Masters' recommendations. So my understanding is that the government has adopted if you like, the easier parts, not to say it's going to be easy for you, but the easier parts, which is to declutter or to simplify the syllabuses for delivery in schools, along with a couple of other things that are easier to do up front. But they have in principle adopted, and I think the board of NESA has in principle adopted, the time disconnect. Do you have any feeling of how that will progress from this point on?
That's the best question, Tim. It's what Professor Masters did was identify the problem: students progressing through years when they didn't have the knowledge. So it's the right problem. If you don't attach the syllabuses to year levels, does that mean that you have year 9 students doing year 4 work because they're still at year 4 work? Is that a personal learning plan for each student? And as much as parents would like that idea, it's simply not feasible with a teacher with 30 students in the class, 6 KLAs in primary school doing personal learning plans across scope and sequence of 6 subjects for 30 kids. It's just not going to happen. They possibly can do it in the literacy and numeracy space. We're investigating models of the syllabus that you're talking about. We're having a look at what Jeff Masters asked us to do. There's a little bit of interest at the moment. I think we might bear some fruit. The national learning progressions, which are sequences of knowledge in English and maths or literacy and numeracy that go from K to 10, they would be an interesting spine to wrap the syllabuses around and do that thing that you've identified, this sort of make sure students understand something before they move to the next. But I would say that the syllabus construction should do that, but we must not try and have an expectation of teachers and schools that's simply not feasible. So we've got to think about the reality of what happens. It's the most exciting and also the most difficult part of Professor Masters' review, and I've got a meeting tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 with the consultants and the groups of experts we've hired to have a look at that for us. So watch this space, Tim.
Yep. So considering it's 8 o'clock, I'm going to end with a difficult question for you to make your life easy, Paul. And it relates obviously to children with disabilities in the HSC space. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there is the option for kids to opt into the life skills space as part of the HSC. But those that are either in support classes or in mainstream, how is there support for those students in relation to attaining an HSC if they're not going to meet the minimum standard?
It is a good question, and it's we have had concerned parents contacting us. I have to say that and I'm not trying to pass the buck here, Tim, but we administer the minimum standard test and then we issue the HSC. The teaching and learning of students is something that the schools and the systems and the sectors have to deal with, and they have to be responsible for. In relation to students with special needs, that we have some categories available for students who are exempt from the minimum standard if they're doing the life skills, English and maths, in that, those two areas. There are other considerations. There are other categories. I called a meeting of the Special Ed Committee of NESA. I had another one yesterday, and I had one 4 or 5 months ago to raise the issue. We wanted to get the advice from the Special Ed Committee about whether we should expand the opportunities for students to be exempt from the minimum standard, have more exemptions. There was the special ed issues. There was also recent arrivals. We've got students who come in as refugees and have only been in the country very briefly, or recent migrants. We've even got students in some schools that are paying overseas students, and they don't have, they're non-English speakers. Should they be exempt? On the first, the Special Ed Committee considered and were absolutely clear that they did not want more exemptions from the minimum standard for students with special needs. Their argument was that they have been fighting for years to get proper access to the HSC credential and to get access to the right teaching and learning for their students to be integrated into the mainstream. And that if there are exemptions for them, that potentially could mean that the attention that needs to be paid to their literacy and numeracy won't occur. Having said that, I know that there are different views out there. I'm happy to talk to individual schools to make sure that students are supported, or for NESA to make contact, because that's where the focus is. As I said, we run the test and we issue the HSC, but we don't teach the kids.
All right, thanks, Paul. All right, we've run a little bit of overtime now, and I think we will now call the evening to a close. So thank you all for attending. If you have any specific questions beyond this, by all means contact PNC Federation and we'll be happy to try and answer those through NESA for you. Those of you who have raised some questions, obviously they'll be passed on to Paul and we'll see what we can do to answer those for you. We'd also appreciate feedback from everybody that's participated tonight. We'd love to know how the actual event went and what you would prefer or like to see in the future. So that will be emailed to you as part of your participation.
Tim, I don't want to hear the criticisms, please. If you can just pass on any of the good stuff. No, I'm only teased. I'd like to hear what you actually think of our work.
Yep, absolutely. And we wouldn't have it any other way for our parents. So absolutely thank you to Paul for taking the time out tonight. I know you've got a really busy schedule during all parts of the year. You're flat out. So really
we all do.
Yeah, really appreciate the time out to do this, and hopefully we'll get you back at some point in the future to see how things are progressing on that front. So thank you all for attending, and I wish everyone a good night and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.